I returned home when I was 29 after a failed marriage. My wife June cheated on me. I exploded. I beat the crap out of her lover and his brother when he intervened, and spent the night in jail. However, my shark lawyer not only released me after one night, but dropped the charges against me. One of her law partners also got the asshole's civil suit dismissed by mutual consent of the parties, when a private investigator she hired caught them buying drugs and threatened to turn the assholes in to the police. When I returned to my hometown, a suburb of a major American metropolitan area, I had only a few $1,000s, but no alimony or child support. We didn't have kids just because June didn't want them. No responsibilities, and a promising new job. I tried to figure out why I wanted to start over in my hometown. It probably had to do with the fond memories I had of my childhood there, even though my parents now lived 2,500 kilometers away. I couldn't wait to see my old school friends, especially Jimmy Andrus. Jimmy and I bonded over athletics at first, but became inseparable because we found common ground at every level. In high school, at 190 centimeters tall and 95 pounds, Jimmy was a quarterback in soccer and an offensive lineman in basketball. At 2 meters tall and 110 kilograms in high school, I was an edge rusher in soccer and a strong forward in basketball. While we weren't like Dan Fouts and Kellen Winslow in soccer or Earl Monroe and Dave DeBuscher in basketball, we were good enough to win conference championships in both sports. After high school, Jimmy and I rarely saw each other in the summer because we were attending colleges on opposite coasts, and my parents moved me to a college my freshman year. However, our friendship was strong enough that I was sure it would easily rekindle when we met again 10 years later. Although I wasn't strong on social media, I followed Jimmy a bit and met up with him for lunch during my 3rd week back home. After we exchanged manly hugs, he said, "Blake Jacobs, you are no different than our graduating class in high school. Is life treating you well?" I still had 2 meters tall and 110 pounds in me, and I was in good shape, but life had treated me unfairly. I told Jimmy about my divorce and the night in jail, but then went straight to more pleasant things. "Except for a few wrinkles on your face, Jimmy, you look just as good too," I said honestly. Despite 3 kids and a demanding job, I still keep in shape, so I'm only 2 pounds heavier than I was in high school. He grinned. I was pleased to see that his life was working out better than mine. He was now the chief operating officer of a large private corporation his father had founded. He had a wife, whom he adored, and 3 young sons, who were 3, 5, and 7 years old at the time. "You should get to know Michelle and the boys as soon as possible," he said as we started eating. "Come to Billy's basketball game Saturday afternoon and stay for dinner," he insisted, since Billy was his 7-year-old son. "I'd love to," I smiled. After spending 90 minutes with Jimmy, I felt like we had only been apart for a month, not 10 years, even though our lives had drifted apart. Jimmy was at Billy's game with his other 2 boys, 5-year-old Sean and 3-year-old Zach. They all seemed like great kids, and it was great to get back into athletics, something I hadn't had much involvement with since college, as my ex-wife June was definitely not into sports. I was surprised at how big Jimmy's 3 sons were for their age. I was sure that Billy would be a power forward like me, not a defender like Jimmy. I stopped wondering about their height when I met Jimmy's wife, Michelle Andrus. I envisioned Michelle to be a petite, energetic, blue-eyed blonde like Jimmy's 2 girlfriends, at different times. Girlfriends from high school. They weren't. Michelle was the most intriguing-looking woman I had ever seen in my life. She had medium-length black-as-tar hair and black irises in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before. Her face wasn't particularly beautiful, although it rated at least an 8 on a 10-point scale. But what set her apart was her figure. As I found out later, because Michelle was proud to tell anyone who was interested, her height in the morning without shoes is 185 centimeters, and her weight is 70 kilograms when she gets on the scale naked every morning. She has a powerful suspension, and her butt, thighs, and voluminous abdominal muscles are definitely rated a 10 on a 10-point scale. On the other hand, her breasts cannot be rated on the scale that normal people would be rated on. Michelle's busts must have weighed 5 pounds each, so massive are they. Definitely the biggest I've ever seen on a slender woman. As I later learned, she has to wear a bandage on her back during jogging, cross-training, or other intense exercise to keep her ripe melons on her chest. She has no excess flesh on any part of her body, unless you count the excess flesh at her bazookas, which I have no doubt would make anyone a heterosexual male. I tried not to gawk as I looked at Michelle. It was really hard. However, she acted like a mom, not a sex symbol, so eventually I was able to curb my lust. Although Michelle was the most attractive woman I'd ever seen, and judging by the way she picked up guys and objects, probably the strongest, her personality didn't match mine. She, to put it as politely as possible, likes her tea strong, actually a cup of green tea that's half cold. Bold and sassy. Michelle ran the family like a seasoned German and took care of their 6-bedroom mini-mansion with a state-of-the-art gym and a small media room with a movie theater without much help. Everyone, including Jimmy, stood in line. I have to admit that the boys, although very active, otherwise normal kids, were the most well-mannered I have ever seen in my life. As time went on, Michelle and I never really developed a liking for each other. For the most part, we were pleasant to each other, but our relationship, while not conflicted, was wary. Despite the wary relationship that Michelle and I had, I soon became a member of the family. I helped out on the weekends by taking the kids to one event or another, and Jimmy, Michelle, and I, most often with a girlfriend but sometimes without, went out almost every Saturday night, including Jimmy's business events or charity events. After I had been home for about 14 months, Michelle gave birth to another boy. I was especially helpful to Michelle with the kids. I treated them as my own, including coaching Billy's amateur basketball team while she was pregnant, including taking them somewhere for the weekend if Jimmy was out of town and she needed a vacation. I was still surprised when Michelle and Jimmy agreed without reservation that their fourth boy would be named Blake and I would be his godfather. I cried, causing Jimmy to choke up and almost cry himself, and Michelle, who was nursing little Blake with one of her giant mammary glands, jokingly called me a pathetic wuss. To give you a better idea of Michelle's character and physique, I will say that 6 months after she gave birth to her fourth boy, she was as trim as when we met and still weighed 70 pounds. I was always curious about Jimmy and Michelle's relationship, given how malleable he seemed and what a strong tea drinker she was. However, I was too polite to ask about it. However, when Jimmy and I stayed overnight out of town at a soccer game and he got drunk for the first time during my time there, he opened up to me. Although he said a lot of things and remembered almost nothing the next morning, his main theme was that Michelle was difficult to deal with, but worth it. Not only because she was such a good mother, but also because, profanity removed and proper language used, that she was the best person to sleep with in the history of mankind and wanted it all the time. A while later he continued, again stated here in a much clearer form than he actually intended. Did you know that she spends 40 minutes a day on her bust, keeping them in top shape with exercise? Did you know there are exercises for them, lotions and creams? She always sleeps on her back and wears a dozen custom-made bras that fit her perfectly and provide maximum support, and my goodness, it's worth it. I really regretted him telling me all of this because it was already hard enough to suppress arousal in Michelle's presence, and after this revelation, it was almost impossible. By the time my namesake little Blake turned 5, Jimmy and I were both 35, Michelle was 34, he was probably as close to being my son as one could ever get. We really seemed to fit together like Jimmy and I had in high school. I also had a great relationship with the other 3 boys, especially Billy, whose amateur basketball team I continued to coach, and little Blake was my honorary assistant, and who lived up to my prediction that he would be a power forward, as he was the biggest and strongest guy his age in the league. Of course, life isn't just a bed of roses, and that became abundantly clear to me and the Andrus family shortly after little Blake turned 5. Jimmy was in a work accident at one of his company's plants he was visiting and ended up in the hospital in a coma. Except for the bump and cut on his head lying in his hospital bed, he looked perfectly normal, but that wasn't the case at all. The doctors had no idea when he would come out of his coma. It could be any moment or, God forbid, never. Fortunately, he had blue ribbon health and disability insurance plans, so at least there would be no economic hardship. Michelle took the situation as well as could be expected, but even her usually stalwart demeanor failed at times, though she tried her best to stay strong for the boys' sake. About the third time I visited Jimmy in the hospital, and it became clear that his coma was likely to last a long time. I promised him, not that he heard or understood me, that I would take care of his family. Although Michelle rarely asked me for help, she never turned it down when offered, and was grateful, in her characteristically understated way, as much as she could. We plunged into a routine. On Wednesday nights, I would take all 4 boys out with me, sometimes on a particularly lucrative date, so that Michelle could have some time to herself, like going to the theater, the movies, or shopping with her mom or sister. Every Friday night, I would bring pizza and salad for everyone at Andrus's mini-mansion, and then play board games or some sports games with all 4 boys. All Saturday and Sunday, I helped Michelle take the kids around to places where they could spend the weekend, and sometimes spent Saturday nights with 1 or 2 of the boys, if I didn't have a date. On Sunday, I also helped in any way I could. This had been going on for 5 months, and the prognosis for Jimmy hadn't changed when Michelle called me at work on Friday morning. In her usual businesslike manner, she told me that there was no need to bring pizza that evening, as there was something else scheduled, and that she had to be there at 7 p.m. instead of 6:15 as usual. I didn't pay much attention to this call until I arrived at the Andrus residence at 6:57, and when I walked in, I never knocked, I was treated like a family member, and called for the boys. There was no response. Michelle walked into the living room in her robe after I'd been there for a couple minutes, and I was about to head out for my life. "Hi, Blake. I'm glad you could make it. The boys aren't around. I talked their grandparents and aunt into taking them over for the night, even though they won't have as much fun as they would with you close by. We have some things to talk over." Though she said it in a cheerful voice, it sounded a little ominous, but I was not startled when she offered me a drink. She drank the brandy in a volley and poured herself another, and then asked me to sit with her in the parlor. After a lengthy conversation with Michelle, which I wasn't used to, she gulped down her second glass of brandy, poured herself a third, and stared at me with her coal black eyes. "Blake, I hope you realize how grateful the boys and I are for your help, and how much Jimmy would appreciate it. We couldn't have done it without you." She almost exhaled, and a rare tear rolled from her left eye. "It's an honor to help. I feel like these boys have become the closest sons I could ever have," I replied sincerely. She smiled, wiped away a tear, and a second unsolicited tear that was about to spill, and then continued. "However, there is something else you can do for our family. I don't know if Jimmy told you, but I have an extremely high libido. I go crazy without sex. Jimmy and I usually have sex at least 5 times a week, even though we've been married for 14 years, she announced with determination in her voice. I figured that didn't apply to me, but I just nodded. Sure, I was blushing. "Either way, I need you to take Jimmy's place, not only in helping the kids and me with the daily chores, but also in bed." I dropped my glass. Luckily, it was almost empty and only consisted of vodka and tonic, so the little bit that spilled on the floor didn't hurt anything. "Just because I couldn't, seriously, he's the best." And like drop by drop, unfinished thoughts, let alone full sentences, flew off my lips, stuttering. "Let me explain it to you this way," Michelle continued, clearly surprised at how stunned I was. "I can't do this anymore. I need to fulfill my sexual needs. If you don't help me, I'll probably go out and sleep with random guys." Would Jimmy want that? Or would he rather have his best friend, someone he knows will treat me well and respect me, fulfill my needs? With those words, she stood up, threw off her robe, which was the only article of clothing she was wearing, and walked toward me. Her naked body was indescribably delicious. The reality was even better than the fantasy. I think I did make a weak protest when she settled on my legs and kissed my lips in a passionate way I'd never experienced before. I had no hope of resistance, however. I couldn't imagine the fortitude that would allow a horny heterosexual man like me to refuse her body. I certainly didn't have what it took. "The boys won't be back until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Let's see how well you can abuse me. Take me to my bedroom. You might think that dragging a 70-pound woman up the stairs would be hard. It would have been if it weren't for the fact that I was so pumped up on adrenaline and so horny that I didn't even think about it." As I lay there in a daze, I had no doubt in my mind that this was the best sexual experience of my life, by a light year. By the time we were in the shower together around 9:30 the next morning, I suddenly realized that what Jimmy had drunkenly told me years ago was true. Having this woman was the most exciting things that could happen to any man. I hoped she wouldn't abuse me too much in the future and take advantage of me because now, like Jimmy, I was probably malleable in her hands. Since I had developed such a good relationship with my 4 sons, Jimmy and Michelle, I was only glad when they were told that from now on, Uncle Blake would be sleeping over on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. The 3 younger boys had no idea of the implications of this, but after 3 weeks, Billy, who was now almost 14 and mature for his age, understood. I thought there might be some problems with Billy. So one weekday, one summer, we went to basketball camp for the day, ate breakfast together, ate lunch there, and then ate dinner together. As we drove home, I really bonded with him. Billy, you're old enough to know that your mom and I have a real relationship now. What do you think about that? He was quiet for a moment, then smiled. Before you started staying with us on weekends, it was really hard on Mom. At times, she was even rude to us kids, which was unusual for her. When she apologized to us, it was clear that the lack of communication coupled with anxiety for Dad had a negative effect on her. Now, with the exception of about an hour after she came home from visiting her dad in the hospital, she is back to normal. I am really happy for her, and I realize that you and she are doing the best you can with this difficult situation. I don't mind if you stay the night. I actually cried. It brought tears to his eyes, too. I hugged him tightly, and then looking into his eyes, I said, "If anything changes, I want you to discuss it with me. I value our relationship." Billy smiled. "No problem, Uncle Coach," he said, and then laughed. While I was certainly having the best sex of my life, so much better than any other I'd had before paled in comparison, I felt remorse every day. I'd never mentioned it to Michelle, but I knew she had her own demons to contend with. However, when we were in each other's arms, there was nothing but pleasure. While we were in bed, she did everything in her power to make me the most satisfied man in the world, and I tried my best to reciprocate. Guilt even made me tell Jimmy about my relationship with Michelle. I visited him at the hospital at least twice a week for an hour or two, usually late at night on weekdays. I would discuss our favorite professional and college sports teams as if we were having dinner together and tell him how the boys were progressing in lacrosse, basketball, swimming, soccer, or whatever sport was in season. After talking about sports and family, I would get real for a few minutes and tell him that I slept with Michelle. I tried to put a positive spin on it by saying that she and I were just meeting our basic needs and that she only loved him. I never went into detail about the sex, but my stories weren't boring either, and I was often surprised at how right he was when he claimed she was the best sexual partner in the history of the world. I even told him sometimes that on a typical weekend, Michelle had more than 24 finishes while I had 7 or 8. Somehow I felt better about coming clean, even though I didn't really have any hope of him actually hearing me. The best news for the Andrews family and simultaneously the best and worst news for me came simultaneously 15 months after Jimmy went into a coma and 10 months after Michelle and I began to have our basic needs met. Jimmy literally snapped out of his coma. That was Thursday afternoon, although he would still have to stay in the hospital until he regained muscle tone. He would not have undergone numerous physical and neurological exams and would have received various therapies. That Friday was the last night Michelle and I had together. It was so bittersweet and bittersweet. The next morning we were both sobbing like babies, but we knew we had to end it. I was especially sullen because I knew that any sexual partner I had in the future would pale in comparison to Michelle, and while our relationship was still somewhat low-key outside of the bedroom, inside the bedroom, our relationship was uninhibited and epic. While my bedroom relationship with Michelle had ended, my relationship with the Andrus family continued. I was still doing what I could to help Jimmy with the boys and readjust to life. Once he came out of his mysterious coma, his prognosis was that he would probably be able to live the rest of his life pretty much as he had before the accident. I was particularly surprised that Jimmy had no trouble remembering his relationship with me, and for 2 months after his discharge from the hospital, we seemed to be as close as ever. Then a really strange thing happened. One day I was driving Jimmy, Little Blake, and Billy home after a soccer game, and Jimmy invited the boys into the house with the words, "Boys, come inside. Uncle Blake and I have something to talk about." I thought it might have something to do with his business, which I was pretty much up to speed on. Instead, he bombarded me with words. "Blake, I want to thank you for taking care of Michelle in the bedroom while I was unwell, and for leaving gracefully when I came to my senses. That must have been difficult, considering how enjoyable your sex life with her was." Damn it! How, how did you, find out? I stammered. "Did Michelle tell you?" "No. I think Michelle is too embarrassed to discuss it. You told me about it at the hospital," he replied calmly. "What the hell?" was my stellar response. "Did you hear me?" "Yes. The doctors during rehab were very impressed with my recollection of events and words I heard around the 3rd month of being in a coma. I remember virtually every word you told me about your relationship with Michelle. I know why you told me that. You're a good friend and you were tormented by guilt, but you believed her when she said she'd get it somewhere else if not from you. I know her and she didn't lie to you about it. I'm grateful that my best friend actually cared about her and the boys, not that she got involved with some asshole," he said firmly. "God, Jimmy, I don't know what to say. I still feel so damn guilty, and frankly, I'd rather you never found out, but to say I'm grateful to you for saying that would be the understatement of the decade," I somehow squeezed out. Jimmy really seemed to believe what he was saying, and there was no obvious animosity as I continued to treat his family as my own. Although the relationship with the boys was great, I noticed that Michelle began to treat me a little warmer than she had before our relationship, but it bothered me that sometimes I would catch her staring at me, or just into space. About 3 months after Jimmy's conciliatory conversation with me on a Tuesday evening, there was a knock on my apartment door shortly after I got home from work and changed out of my suit into shorts and a t-shirt. It was Michelle, wearing a raincoat despite the clear skies. "Blake, I need to talk to you about something," she mumbled rather than said. There was an expression in her coal-black eyes that I hadn't seen before, or at least hadn't noticed. They had a kind of desperate look to them. I really didn't want to be alone with her, but at the same time she was a friend of mine who clearly needed help, so I invited her in. Michelle got straight to the point. "Blake, Jimmy has changed since he got out of the hospital. He's not as passionate as he used to be, and I'm hurting. I think back to the time we spent together and what I miss now, and I need to have sexual relations with you, even if it's just once a week," she blurted out, while simultaneously removing her raincoat, the only article of clothing she was wearing besides her high-heeled shoes. I tried to resist. I honestly and genuinely tried. However, the more she pressed and literally begged me, the more I remembered the most sexually fulfilling time of my life and felt my resolve weakening. I even tried to lock myself in my bedroom, but as I had said earlier, she was the strongest woman I had ever met, and in order to close the door in front of her, I would have had to truly hurt her, which was impossible for me. It was over, except for the guilt that had arisen. Given Michelle's desperation and the fact that I hadn't had sex since I last had her over 4 months ago, our sexual intensity was even higher than it had been in the past. I didn't think it was possible. As she took a quick shower, without my help, and put her cape back on after those 2 hours of bliss, she kissed me hard. "I need you to call my cell phone to make future arrangements," she said, and walked out of my apartment. I never had dinner that night. I did nothing but shower and stare mindlessly at the TV, not even realizing that there were shows on that I hated and never watched. When I finally woke up from a restless sleep the next day, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't become the asshole that my ex-wife June had slept with. I had to go. Thanks to a great recommendation from my current boss, even though I had given him short notice of my termination and the help of my father's acquaintances, I had gotten 3 interviews in 3 days in the city where my parents now lived, and notified my landlord that I was vacating the apartment I was renting. That Saturday, I broke the news to the Andrus family. The boys cried, Jimmy cried. While everyone else was worried, Michelle left the house. I knew she had gone to the shed in the backyard. After coming up with some lame excuse that everyone else bought into, I tracked her down. I found her in the shed, devastated. I grabbed her wrists and pulled her tightly against me. At first, she tried to break free, but I was determined and held her tight. As we looked into each other's eyes, I told her that I was in love with her, which was 90% true, but that I couldn't stab Jimmy in the back or be the asshole who had my ex-wife, which was 100% true. So I had to leave. I pressed her giant breasts against my chest and kissed her hard, and then turned around and walked away, got in my car, and started my 2,500-kilometer journey to my new life. In my new home, I kept in touch with the Andrus family, mostly through social media, but also by phone. Little Blake and Zach, the second oldest boy, came to visit me twice, each time for a week. I analyzed videos of Billy playing in high school and gave him some advice. I even got on the phone with Michelle twice in the presence of other family members, once to congratulate her on the birth of her 5th child. They named the 5th child a little girl, the first female child in the Andrus family, Amanda. With 4 older brothers, she was indeed spoiled. With the exception of my personal life, things were going well in my new city, especially at work. I enjoyed my job and started making really good money for the first time, and was able to immediately buy a very nice 3-bedroom house on a large lot with a pool and basketball court. I went on dates and had fun from time to time, but Michelle spoiled me for other women. I never found anyone close to special. It was almost 4 years after I had separated from the Andrus family. I was 41 years old when I started having trouble communicating with them. For about 2 months, I rarely received responses to emails or texts and had no contact by phone. On a Wednesday in the summer, I was in my office when I got a call on my cell phone. The phone said Michelle Andrus was calling, though I didn't recognize the number. "Hi, this is Blake Jacobs," I answered, not sure if it was really Michelle. "Hi, Blake, it's Michelle. I hope you're still doing well," she began. We chatted for only a minute, and then she got down to business. "Some members of the Andrus clan are coming to your town this weekend. Are you ready to host some guests?" "Sure, who's coming?" I asked. "I'm not sure of the exact lineup yet, but we promise not to overwhelm you," she replied. "Sure, come. I'll be happy to see you guys. When do you expect to arrive?" "Toward evening, probably by 1 o'clock Saturday, if you don't mind." "I'll be ready. Let me give you directions in case your GPS doesn't work," I replied. The call was cut off as quickly as it came in. I was puzzled, but pleased at the same time. I thought I had done something wrong and that the Andrus family members had ostracized me, but apparently that was not the case. Even though I usually keep my house clean, I'm only 1 step away from a cleanliness obsession. I wanted everything to be in perfect condition. So I hired a cleaning service to do a thorough cleaning, hired a handyman to fix a few little things, bought a few items to spruce up the interior a bit, gave the place an aesthetic makeover, and made sure the pool and basketball court were in perfect condition. At 1:04 p.m. on Saturday, not that I keep track of time, Michelle pulled up in her 7-passenger van. 2 excited boys jumped out of it. Little Blake, who was no longer a toddler, and Zach, who had visited me last summer. After handling them, I saw Michelle walk up to me holding 3-year-old Amanda's hand. I had only seen a few not-so-great pictures of Amanda. When I saw her in person, I realized what this trip was all about. I put my arms around Michelle. I knelt down and reached out for little Amanda's hand, but instead she gave me a gentle but firm, girlish hug. Michelle, now in her 40s, looked the same as when we first met. She had an open belly showing off her impressive form, and her ass and thighs were nicely covered by her shorts. And she also had stunning breasts that towered over the landscape like 2 peaks. I grinned. "You look good. Still weighing 70 pounds? "No, I weighed 71 pounds this morning. I'll have to put on a little extra," she grinned back. I quickly determined that the 4 of them were the only visitors. Billy, Sean, and Jimmy weren't going to show up. I made them lunch and then gave them a tour. Zach and little Blake showed them many of the things they were familiar with, including the descent into the pool and the retractable net behind the basketball backboard. The day was hot and the kids were begging to go swimming. Amanda already knew how to swim, and Zach was an insanely loving big brother who we could trust to watch her. So Michelle and I sat sipping iced tea in the shade from where we could watch the kids frolicking, but not be brooders. So, when did you find out I was Amanda's biological father? I asked unceremoniously. Once I saw Amanda in person, it was like looking at pictures of my mother when she was very young, including her very distinctive eyes and forehead. I was sure I was as soon as I found out I was pregnant about a month after I left your apartment, when we fucked each other senseless that Tuesday night, a few days before you left. I was having my most fruitful period when I wasn't on birth control, and Jimmy was only partially done at the time, she replied carelessly. When were you going to tell me? I inquired. Shortly after Jimmy guessed everything, which he did about 2 months ago, and that's why the connection on our part became tenuous, she replied carelessly again. How did he find out? The DNA test. What was his reaction? And that's exactly what I was hoping for. He filed for divorce. Why were you hoping for that? Because I want to be with you, not him. Ever since his accident, he hasn't been himself, and even before that, he wasn't as good as you in bed, she said, looking through me with her coal black eyes. What makes you think I want a relationship with you? I asked. Because sex with me is the most satisfying thing you've ever had in your life. And besides, you love my kids so much you can't help but want to raise your own. She grinned rather than said. You're not divorced yet? I'll be here in a month. We've already divided the property as agreed. Jimmy is looking after the house. Billy is going to college this fall, and Sean wanted to finish high school in his hometown. I got full custody of Zach, Blake, and Amanda, and they were happy to move in and live with Uncle Blake. Even Amanda, when her brothers told her how wonderful you were. And when I explained to her the best way a 3-year-old can understand that you are her real daddy, Michelle stated. Where are you going to sleep tonight? Here, of course. Our luggage is in the car, and our supplies will be delivered by truck on Monday. The boys will sleep in a room with bunk beds, just like the last 2 summers they came to visit you. Amanda will have a guest room, and she will love it once we get it fixed up. I'll sleep in the bed with you. I don't know how much you'll sleep, especially the first week, but we'll sleep in the same bed as you, she replied coldly. Of course, I wanted to show my superiority. I wanted to let her know that I wasn't weak. I wanted to show her that she couldn't just show up here and tell me how my life was going to go. I wanted to do all that. But I didn't. I looked at little Amanda, who, giggling, was jumping into little Blake's arms in the pool, and my heart filled with fatherly pride. And I thought about how excited my parents would be to become grandparents. I looked at Michelle's smooth, muscular thighs and vividly remembered the pot of honey between them. I admired Michelle's stunning busts, which were literally bursting out of her tank top. I looked into Michelle's eyes and felt the passion emanating from them penetrate my brain. So after a moment's pause to maintain the illusion of control, I replied, Sounds like a plan. Michelle and I have been married for 3 years. We won't be having any more children anytime soon because she had her fallopian tubes tied when Amanda was born. But Zach and little Blake are like family to me, and Amanda is the light of my life. I thought about how lucky I was that my best friend was in an industrial accident, and how shitty it turned out for him. I would have felt guilty about it if it weren't for the fact that it caused me nothing but pure, genuine joy and love.